My dear Mr. Capuz, you shall not be without a greeting from me when Christmas comes, and when you, in the midst of the holiday, are bearing your solitude more heavily than usual. But if then you notice that it is great, rejoice because of this. For what, ask yourself, would solitude be that had no greatness? There is but one solitude, and that is great, and not easy to bear, and to almost everybody come hours when they would gladly exchange it for any sort of intercourse, however banal and cheap, for the semblance of some slight accord with the first comer, with the unworthiest. But perhaps those are the very hours when solitude grows, for its growing is painful, as the growing of boys, and sad as the beginning of springtimes. But that must not mislead you. The necessary thing is after all but this: solitude, great inner solitude, going into one's self and for hours meeting no one. This one must be able to attain. To be solitary, the way one was solitary as a child, when the grown-ups went around involved with things that seemed important and big because they themselves looked so busy, and because one comprehended nothing of their doings. And when one day one perceives that their occupations are paltry, their professions petrified and no longer linked with living, why not then continue to look like a child upon it all as upon something unfamiliar, from out of the depth of one's own world, out of the expanse of one's own solitude, which is itself work and status and vocation? Why want to exchange a child's wise incomprehension for defensiveness and disdain, since incomprehension is after all being alone, while defensiveness and disdain are a sharing in that from which one wants by these means to keep apart? Think, dear sir, of the world you carry within you, and call this thinking what you will, whether it be remembering your own childhood or yearning toward your future. Only be attentive to that which rises up in you and set it above everything that you observe about you. Only the individual who is solitary is like a thing placed under profound laws, and when he goes out into the morning that is just beginning, or looks out into the evening that is full of happening, and if he feels what is going on there, then all status drops from him as from a dead man, though he stands in the midst of sheer life. If there is nothing in common between you and other people, try being close to things. They will not desert you. There are the nights still, and the winds that go through the trees and across many lands. Among things and with the animals, everything is still full of happening, in which you may participate. And children are still the way you were as a child, sad like that and happy. And if you think of your childhood, you live among them again, among the solitary children, and the grown-ups are nothing, and their dignity has no value. And if it worries and torments you to think of your childhood and of the simplicity and quiet that goes with it, because you cannot believe any more in God, who appears everywhere in it, then ask yourself, dear Mr. Capuz, whether you really have lost God. Is it not rather that you have never possessed him? For when should that have been? Do you believe that a child can hold him whom men bear only with effort and whose weight compresses the old? Do you believe that anyone who really has him could lose him like a little stone? Or do you not think rather that whoever had him could only be lost by him? But if you know he was not in your childhood, and not before, if you suspect that Christ was deluded by his longing, and Muhammad betrayed by his pride, and if you are terrified to feel that even now he is not, in this hour when we speak of him. What then justifies you in missing him, who never was, like one who has passed away, and in seeking him as though he had been lost? Why do you not think of him as the coming one, imminent from all eternity, the final fruit of a tree whose leaves we are? What keeps you from projecting his birth into times that are in process of becoming, and living your life like a painful and beautiful day in the history of a great gestation? For do you not see how everything that happens keeps on being a beginning? And could it not be his beginning, since beginning in itself is always so beautiful? If he is the most perfect, must not the lesser be before him, so that he can choose himself out of fullness and overflow? Must he not be the last, in order to encompass everything within himself? And what meaning would we have if he, whom we long for, had already been? As the bees bring in the honey, so do we fetch the sweetest out of everything and build him. With the trivial even, with the insignificant, if it but happens out of love, we make a start, with work and with rest after it, with a silence or with a small solitary joy, with everything that we do alone, without supporters and participants. We begin him whom we shall not live to know, even as our forebears could not live to know us. And yet they, who are long gone, are in us, as predisposition, as burden upon our destiny, as blood that pulsates, and as gesture that rises up out of the depths of time. Is there anything that can take you from the hope of thus some day being in him, the farthest, the ultimate? Celebrate Christmas, my dear Mr. Capuz, in this devout feeling that perhaps he needs this very fear of life from you in order to begin. These very days of your transition are perhaps the time when everything in you is working at him, as you have already once, in childhood, breathlessly worked at him. Be patient and without resentment, and think that the least we can do is to make his becoming not more difficult for him than the earth makes it for the spring when it wants to come. And be glad and confident. Yours, Rainer Maria Rilke. I wanted to start this video without any formal introduction because, like my last video, it was somewhat of a long reading, but I love reading Rilke's letters, and this is possibly my favorite one. I love hearing him talk about solitude. This is something I have cherished, and it seems to be the case that there are people naturally inclined to it, that just, without having some semblance of loneliness and isolation, being solely with oneself and entering into deep quiet, that such a person cannot live. There's something so fundamental about it, at least for me. And when I perchance stumbled across Rilke, I found out he was somebody like this too. And surely there are plenty of others. But the commonality is that they all seem to be eccentric and individual, and it makes a lot of sense because people who fit in just fine with others, I mean, that is their equivalent of solitude. They identify with the norms and modes of behavior that are typical. Whereas the solitary man, as Rilke would call him and Nietzsche would call him, is so far apart from what is expected of a person, what is expected of his thoughts and his inner constitution. He just does, there's something so intrinsic to his character that deviates from the quote-unquote normal person. And this is something I've struggled with in my life. I have always had a problem initiating conversations with people because I could never get into what they were saying. I mean, my interests are just so far out of line with what kindles in people's thoughts and just in daily life. I just do not register with a lot of things that people ordinarily talk about. And so I can play the small talk game, and I'm not saying let's abolish small talk. That's good rapport. I mean, we need this to relate to each other. We can't be talking about God and death and all of these huge things all of the time. And yet I am drawn to such thoughts like a magnetic force, and there are others like this who just seamlessly go through life and people don't even suspect they're having these tremendous thoughts and feelings inside of them. And so solitary people rejoice in the human capability to feel. And those who flock to groups and do not spend much time alone they have the opposite attitude toward humans' feelings and imaginings. But there is something just so loose and free that occurs in my being when I reduce stimuli and when I go on my own for a while and let things catch up within me and just don't expect anything from myself. Just say, walk nowhere, just sit here, write, or just an unconditional I'm alive and just watching what arises within me and taking moments to just be grateful that this life happened at all. I mean, I am just bamboozled by this all of the time. Just how did this life even occur? And people embedded in religious traditions have easy answers for this. And I maybe have intimations of what. I mean, clearly something incredibly strange gave birth to this world, this universe. And that's as far as I will go. The only thing I'm sure of is that we're alive, that this life is real. That's it for me. The whereabouts of it and the causality beats me. And there's something in that mystery that I just love. At first sight, it's scary because it's so multitudinous and you can't grasp it. It's scary because there's no order there. And when these thoughts occur to such a person, just how much of a chaotic spawn life is. I mean, if you treat the origin of life as something unknowable, that will drive some people mad. Just as not knowing where it leads will drive someone mad. And yet, I would like to talk about his description of God here, because I am at once a religious and irreligious person. I am not traditionally religious, and yet I have had so many experiences where I inhabited some sort of religious contemplation, and just having insights or feelings that seem to signify something beyond my understanding, and feelings of love and equally anxiety and despair, just really elevated or sunken feelings that are just so far out from any sort of bland homeostasis. I have to bring in the word religious because it's just so unfounded. These feelings occur so spontaneously, and I can't predict them, and I'm sure as I carry out this life, I will encounter many more feelings that are just so surreal. And I think often, unfortunately, people are dishonest about this. We are just afraid to share that we have this vast, as I've put it before, vocabulary of feeling. And it's always growing. When we're young, we don't really know that we're feeling beings. We express the whole range of emotion, and yet only when consciousness develops, adolescence and later, that's when we really inhabit the spheres of feeling and really know when we're suffering and when we're happy and tearful and bland. This is just, life goes in so many different directions. But as pertains to God, as he invoked here, this is something that has always frustrated me about the Christian theology, is that it promulgates the fall of man, that our harmony with God has been torn asunder, and each moment brings only a greater distance between us and God. Whereas Rilke, so cleverly and remarkably, here tells Mr. Capuz that God is immanent. And I love this. It is, we're not falling away from him, we are building up to him. Each moment brings us ever nearer to him. And he gets Mr. Capuz to contemplate whether or not his pangs and sufferings that ail him inside are not absolutely necessary to the construction of the most beautiful God, that we are the cultivators of this. And I just love this. I mean, this, if you don't have that conception, I don't know how you can live if you just are ever confronting the alleged fact that we are only getting further and further away from God. That we are doomed from the start. We're carrying out a needless life, and our only chance at redemption is to succumb to accepted dogmas and get everybody to believe. I mean, for one, that's just a very unrealistic aspiration. It's clear that by the day, less and less people seem to believe in these, and, well, that saddens me because there's a definite role that religion, organized religion, plays in homogenizing and centering human beings. And this is really the gamble. Do you want to be homogenized and under the blanket of some shared tradition, or do you want to be maladapted and your own, and have your own theology, essentially? And Rilke, as well as myself, are people who seem to concoct our own theologies, or rather, no, because my proof and it doesn't have to suffice for you guys, but it's good enough for me, that, like Rilke says, God is immanent, is that as I play out my life, as I just let it do its thing, and don't judge where I'm at, just allow my transitions to occur of themselves, and to endure my most loathsome states that I feel nobody should have to go through, that just unreasonable pain that seems to be inflicted on me unfairly. Yet I go through them, and I will have to go through them again. But it seems that each time that I do make it through them, I get the inkling of God's immanence. I touch a new part of personality or soul or something. I know I'm speaking very grandiosely here, but I'm sorry. These are things that I just know internally. Each time I go through these periods of suffering, I am recompensed by some apprehension or connection with, I'm fine with calling it God. And whether he's the same as the one that's espoused by tradition, I don't know. And I have no problem thinking that he is. I just have a problem with some of the framework for the traditions, how they conceive things. And so, I only really get these sorts of conclusions and questions when I have solitude. And I feel that if I didn't have solitude, I would be something completely different and something not myself. And so, I've always had this sort of knowing that that is the case, and so I do distance myself from people, even my family, and people I work with, and friends. It's not out of any disdain or lack of love for them. I just am somebody driven to that. And there are people like that, maybe even more than I think, or that we all think. And we just don't see them. They just are hidden somehow. And this letter is just so beautiful. I love also that he analogizes human beings with bees and leaves. He's naturalistic in this regard, and I share in this too. I mean, this is another thing that I'm not fond of with the theologies, is that they utterly, at least Christianity, demonize nature. And well, let's face the facts, nature can be pretty brutal. And yet there is also beauty there too, and very intricate design and function. And as a consequence of the scientific Weltanschauung that has come into play, we are only now recognizing our share in nature's existence. We are natural beings, and I'm not saying solely or what. Maybe there is a metaphysical and spiritual origin to human beings as well. I don't know. I don't claim to know. I don't know how I'll ever find out. And yet there are many things about us that are just explicitly natural. I mean, we have to come to terms with this. We have very crude feelings inside of us and desires and instincts. There's just no denying our connection with nature, even its darker parts. And that's just something that we have to look at and grow up and just live with. And I'm not saying that is easy, but somebody without that insight is usually the type of person who is overcome by the lesser parts of his instinctual nature. He is prey to his weaker impulses and probably abuses other people, abuses himself. And that's another thing we have to face. We all abuse ourselves in our own individual ways. And sometimes we don't know, and sometimes we know all too well how we are compromising ourselves. And yet there is the creativity of nature that I am always trying to get in touch with and get people to see. The worker bees, the leaves. Think of fruits. Even animals, though they are hunted and killed for their meat, they're still providing sustenance to the human that eats them. There is this mutual compensation between all natural life. And well, I think the ultimate task of the individual is to ask himself, what is that I can give to nourish other life, be they human or not? You have to bring that to fruition. You have to be the plant that harvests fruit. What are our fruits? This is different for everybody, and this is one of the beautiful things about human beings, is that there is no singular end product from us. We can go in a million ways as to how we want to feed the life that does exist and that we cannot deny exists. There is life everywhere, and where there is not life, we infuse life with our imaginings and projections. And people don't like that word projection because it's psychological, and it makes it seem that humans are utterly deluded and not seeing things for what they are. Well, this is another thing that we have to come to terms with. Say, we get really angry at somebody. Well, is it something particular about that person, or has something that person done awakened something inside of us some feeling that we don't like, and we are emptying that feeling out onto them for our own rejuvenation, and probably causing a scene where none is necessary? Well, somebody only with the insight into psychological projections can mitigate this and maybe be friendlier and without resentment, as he said. There are just these facts of our nature and our intertwinement with nature that people need to confront headlong and not be ashamed of. And this is so hard for people to do, and some people don't even have the first thought about it. Good for them, I say. But there are people driven to solitude, driven to thought, who, I think Jung put it, that we become conscious to a point where we are forced to reckon with instincts in us that drive themselves toward things against our, I would put it, spiritual will. The beholder of actions, the observer. There's some strong conglomeration of feelings that arises within us, and it makes us do things that the seer does not want us to do. And nonetheless it occurs because our instincts are incredibly strong. A person driven to solitude is forced to reckon with this. He watches himself probably closer than any other type of person, and he knows better than any other that each of us does things that we can't even help doing. It is this sort of determinism, but I am what is called a compatibilist here, where I recognize some free willness to human experience, but there's also some deterministic aspects of human experience. That our bodies are almost just take food. I mean, if we have access to food, we're destined to eat it at some time because we get hungry, and the drive to satiate our hunger just overcomes us completely. Yeah, I mean, this is just something we gotta look at. And so, somebody driven to solitude is forced to reckon with this, and it's not easy. At the end, you have to come to terms with the fact that our nature has its own rules, but also there is something in us that perhaps is anti-natural. Our imagination, our spirit, our intellect, this inner world, our fantasies. And so, I recognize, as Maslow put it, that humans are simultaneously gods and worms. It's so perfectly put. And in my experience, solitude has brought me closer to the God in man, in nature, in me. And sometimes, unfortunately, when one spends too much time with other people, they are swallowed by the worm in themselves, succumb to the weaker parts of themselves, and have unrealized parts of their nature that just wither away and die, and thus the fruit that you could have given cannot be restored. It's gone. You lost that potential, and that's it. So I'm going to end it here, and I recommend to anyone who maybe is frightful of aloneness and maybe encounters parts of themselves that they do not wish to see when they are alone, and so surround themselves with distractions and people and noise, clutter. I suggest that you really sink in to solitude and do confront those feelings, because you could be detracting from this immanent God that he talks about here, that there is something fundamental to your acknowledging these feelings and not letting them play within you deleteriously. So I'm going to end it there. Thanks for tuning in, guys.